Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. The flow of asylum seekers across Roxham Road in Quebec has exploded, says Premier François Legault. He says it has become untenable for Quebec and is calling for the entry point to be closed. So too is opposition leader Pierre Poilievre.
If we are a real country, we have borders. And if this is a real Prime Minister, he is responsible for those borders. That is why Conservatives are calling for the Prime Minister to implement a plan to close the Roxham Road crossing within 30 days from now.
But the PM says closing that irregular border crossing is more complicated.
The way to close Roxham Road is to renegotiate the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States, which is something that we've been working on for many months now.
So what's to be done about Roxham Road? How are the politics of all of this playing out? Let's bring in at issue Chantal Hebert, Coyne and Althia Raj. Good to see you all tonight. I feel like we've had this conversation before, but we're going to have it again because the numbers have peaked again, and this has obviously become an issue for the Quebec Premier. Chantal, what is why is the Premier making this an issue right now? Is there anything that can be done here to sort of appease him or satisfy him in terms of a solution?
Do you have an hour?
No.
The numbers are by the thousands. They're not going down. It's the dead of winter, so you can imagine what is going to happen once the weather gets nicer. The fact is that Quebec's services, social services, classe d'accueil, the classrooms where you send kids who arrive and don't speak French or English in many instances, are full at the time of labor shortages. It's not just the Premier who is saying we have reached capacity, it's also the Mayor of Montreal. For those who live far away, she is not an ideological friend of the Premier. No. More to the left and he's more to the right. The fact is that this inflow of asylum seekers is massively coming into Quebec. And at some point, the capacity of Quebec to find housing for them in a housing crisis, et cetera, has now been not only reached, but exceeded.
Yeah, and it's not even a question of money at this point because the federal government's been giving them plenty of money. It's as you say, all the other things that go with it. So, Andrew, when you hear François Legault, Pierre Poilievre and others say we need to close Roxham Road, I think lots of people are confused by that kind of rhetoric because it's not clear what you would do to close it. So what do you think they're talking about in terms of a solution then?
Well, they're assuming there is a solution, first of all. When we in the pundit trade are also in the business of providing easy solutions to things, but some problems aren't so easily resolved. And simply, declaring it closed or putting up a fence or what have you, doesn't necessarily solve anything. The reason people go to Roxham Road is because they know they get turned back at the regular crossings. If they know they're going to get turned back at Roxham Road, they're going to go somewhere else. So it's not a particularly realistic solution when you have these kinds of numbers. There's obviously deeper forces that are impelling people to want to take their chances of going through an irregular crossing to get to Canada. When there's that kind of demand, it's hard to simply choke it off. It's not a huge deal more realistic to just simply wave your hand and say, oh, well, we'll renegotiate the Safe Third Country Agreement and we'll apply it all the way across the border to every conceivable crossing point. Not only do you have to get the Americans' agreement to that, which is, as we've seen, is also easier said than done, but you also have to get essentially the agreement of the people crossing to agree to be caught. If you're going to turn them back to the Americans, you actually have to get your hands on them. And if they know they're going to be caught and sent back, they may simply continue to elude our grasp on this. So, as long as what's really driving this is the discrepancy in the real or perceived treatment people are going to receive in the refugee systems between Canada and the United States. And as long as the Canadian system is seen to be more generous or the U.S. system is seen to be more illiberal, there's going to be that impetus for people to try to move from one country to the other. And I close by simply saying I think this is a problem that's much more about managing it and trying to regularize it and trying to get our hands on who's coming into the country rather than simply thinking we can close off a 5,000-mile border.
So how does the rhetoric then that we're hearing, Althia, on all sides, help us get to that point that Andrew's talking about, because it doesn't sound like we're in the solution mode for anyone.
Well, we could be, because I think there are solutions. But I just want to go back to something that Andrew said. Yeah. The profile of the asylum seekers is changing. And, you know, you compare January numbers 2022, there was a little over 2,000. January 2023 numbers, there's about like 4,700. They used to be people who were coming in from Nigeria, Haitians who actually had family in Quebec. Yep. Now you may have seen those stories in early February about the city of New York actually paying Venezuelan migrants bus tickets to send them to Plattsburgh so they can cross at Roxham Road. And so you have places like New York City trying to offload their problem into Canada. And I think that is why we've seen François Legault's rhetoric change. Because during the election, he was talking about the crisis at Roxham Road with a nationalistic lens, talking about how all these migrants were diluting the presence of French in Quebec, and this was an existential threat to the province. Now he's writing a letter to the Canadians in the Globe and Mail talking about the things that Chantal talked about, the resources. The Prime Minister's answer, to me, is not really an answer. The Canadian Association for Refugee Lawyers has suggested that the government just look within, actually, the Safe Third Country Agreement at Article 6, which basically gives the government the right to say, well, this class of refugees, we will accept them. So asylum seekers who are usually denied claims in the U.S. because of gender-based violence, Canada would say, we are welcoming you. And by saying that, they could cross at regular crossings. Mm-hmm. So they could do that for a bunch of different groups of asylum seekers, and then you would disperse the problem across the country. Because the other issue that we're not really talking about is that Ottawa itself has failed. Having refugees or would-be refugees wait 2 years to get treated by the Canada Border Services Agency is the federal government lacking in its duty. Having to wait 2 years to get a work permit, that is the federal government lacking in its duty. So it's nice to see them want to now move these asylum seekers to the Atlantic provinces, for example, because there's a need there and we need to move them. But there are things that Ottawa itself could be doing to alleviate the problem.
Chantal.
Yes, but the solution of which is now become the latest federal solution of moving people to other provinces will come to a limit. I was reading about Niagara Falls, where many have now been brought in hotel rooms. Well, that may be fine in February. It's not tourism season, but it's not a situation that can last. And Althea is right. Most of the people who cross at Roxham Road would find good employment or decent employment in Canada, except that it takes forever to process them and to give them a work permit. And over that period, you kind of leave them in limbo. Meanwhile, taking people to other provinces cannot be a long-term solution. If you're going to do that, then go Andrew's route. Suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, and they will come in greater numbers, possibly, but they will spread out at regular border crossings, and at least you'll get a handle on who's coming. But the one thing we saw this week, through the interview that U.S. Ambassador David Cohen gave to, I believe, the CBC, is that if that's a priority for the U.S., it's certainly not the message that the ambassador had. His message was, we need to take we need to fix the source of the problem, i.e., why would people want to be refugees? Well, good luck with that.
Last word to you, Andrew.
Just remind people that, you know, when we talk about renegotiating the Safe Third Country Agreement or suspending it, we're presuming that it's still going to be around. But it has been challenged before the courts. It's been tossed up by some courts, held up on appeal. But there's certainly a live possibility it could be tossed out as being unconstitutional by the courts, in which case we're back to square one.
Welcome to another round of At Issue. A parliamentary committee is broadening its study of foreign interference after reports suggesting China tried to influence the outcome of the last one. Pierre Poilievre says the Prime Minister has not done enough to stop it. Justin Trudeau says Canadians can trust the democratic system.
Canadians can and should continue to have faith in their institutions around this. And they need to know that everyone is taking this seriously. What is not serious is putting a partisan spin on this, is playing political games to try and get partisan advantage out of undermining people's confidence in our institutions.
Should the government be sharing more information with Canadians? Let's bring in everybody again. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. Althia, I'm going to start with you. I mean, I think there's a real concern at this point now in people's trust in the electoral process because of this conversation and because we don't really know what's going on. So how concerned are you about that, and how concerned should the government be about that?
Well, the government saying that the opposition is playing politics is a little bit much. I wish that, I mean, we talked about this on Friday, but I do wish the Prime Minister had been more clear and was being more transparent about what the government knew and when it knew it and what it did about it. Because at the moment, now the media are having to fill in the blanks. You know, you learn through reading the last report on this panel that was struck in 2019 that they actually have a very, very limited mandate. They can only speak out publicly if they feel like something is actually threatening the integrity of the entire election. Like they feel like there is a game changer here and they must warn the public about it. Otherwise, they don't want to be like James Comey in 2016. They want to keep their mouth shut to make sure that they don't affect the outcome of the election. But instead of explaining that to the public, the Prime Minister is like, no, don't worry, there's nothing really to see here, does not instill confidence. The other thing, I think, is that there's a lot of questions here for Elections Canada to answer. There's a lot of questions for political parties themselves to answer. And taking all this together, along with, allegations that the Chinese are running police stations in Canada, that the Iranian regime is going after some members of the diaspora here, like these are very concerning things. And we have no faith because the government is not telling us what law enforcement and intelligence agencies are doing about it.
Chantal.
For sure, it doesn't work to have the Prime Minister tell people that they should take it on faith, that they should have faith in the system. Mm-hmm. Just listening to it, you think, what's wrong with this picture? If Justin Trudeau is serious about the perils of playing politics with it, and I do believe those perils are real. Yes. That once you start doubting the system, you start doubting the outcome of elections, and then that gets you where. But if he is serious, he needs to take politics out of it. He can't be the face of the government's response telling you all is under control. Yeah. You would need to hear from independent voices about the state of the situation. And that's just not happening. Up to a point, Justin Trudeau is playing the same game as Pierre Poilievre. They're both playing politics with the issue.
Well, there is a committee that we'll hear from some witnesses next week, Andrew, some of them politicians, some of them officials, but is Chantal right? Do we need to hear from someone, the head of CSIS or someone who can say, here's what we can tell you and here's what we can't?
Yes, I mean, we need to hear from them, and we also need to see further investigations into the allegations that are contained in these documents. I mean, the scandal on this thing keeps shifting and keeps expanding and compounding with each passing day. It was initially, how dare the Chinese government engage in this kind of scandalous behavior of not only smearing candidates they didn't like, mostly conservatives, but also, it seems, clandestinely funding by illegal means candidates they did like, mostly liberal candidates. That's scandalous enough. It's scandalous that this was known, certainly within the security services, and was, you have to believe, was passed on to the powers that be in the Prime Minister's office, and yet not very much seems to have been either done about it or communicated about it either to the public or to the people affected. But it's now in the situation where, this having come to light, the Prime Minister gives these brazen answers where, I don't think we fully were captured by the comments you quoted, where he was basically suggesting if you raised complaints about this, you were playing into China's hands, you were doing China's work for it. Or Jennifer O'Connell, the Liberal Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs in committee, was basically saying, well, you're just being like Donald Trump if you complain about this. Well, no. It's, election denialism is if you complain about elections being unfair or lacking integrity with no evidence to support it. If you've got evidence that something bad was happening, nobody's suggesting that it compromised the whole result of the election, but there's a real possibility that, you know, more than one riding was affected by this. Well, that's not denialism, that's raising legitimate concerns. And so to try and sort of brazen it out the way that they seem to be the strategy at this point is not doing anybody any good. So yes, we need to hear
Though
we
I was
need
just
to
going
hear
to say
politicians on, we need to hear politicians, but we also need to see these things being investigated.
Chantal, go ahead.
And I don't believe a parliamentary committee is necessarily the best venue for that. And why do I say that? Because we've all seen what happens in parliamentary committees. So when I meant taking the politics out of it, I didn't mean a parliamentary committee asking the questions to which they want the answers rather than the questions they should be asking out of independent voices.
You're right.
I meant something a bit larger than that.
Yeah, I'm looking for answers.
The other thing we should say is
it's
fascinating that this has come out, because this would involve presumably somebody at CSIS leaking this. They'd be facing very severe consequences if they were caught. They would have to have very strong reasons to feel they had to do this.
Oh yeah, I mean they would be arrested, I think, right? This is information that they are not legally allowed to share.
So
Althia,
clearly somebody is very unsatisfied with the way the government's been handling this.
Chantal, Althia, last word to you here.
And can you blame them, right? Because it looks like they're not handling it at all. I just want to pick up on two things. One, I think not just the public and, you know, what did the government know, when did it know it, but this type of information should be actually shared with political parties so they themselves can go and look, like when we're talking about illegal donations, that's something that, you know, the internal party should be able to go look at their records and see if there's anything fishy, and they would only know that if somebody actually warns them about it. So I think that's important. But I do think that we need to add nuance to this conversation, because you don't want people to leave thinking like, oh, the results of the last election was changed because China interfered. And there is, I think, a fine line between, you know, what the government of China wants, what the regime wants, and what some candidates themselves are saying and what some political parties themselves are saying. Because if you look back in 2015, for example, there was a lot of allegations from the Conservative Party and the Chinese press against the Liberals on drugs, for example, and then that changed in the last election. And there are sympathies that may not necessarily be foreign agents, and which leads to another point, which is the Liberals should really move on the foreign registry that they have suggested and then haven't done anything about.
Chantal wants one last word. Yeah.
I think the last person to convince Canadians, and I do believe that the outcome of the last election was with the outcome that we have fair and square. But I think the last person to reassure Canadians that that is so is the person who won. And who was said to be the person that those who interfered or tried to interfere wanted to have win. It's easy enough to say after the fact, by the way, as some Chinese diplomats are saying, oh, ha, ha, this is the outcome we wanted. That's like me saying, ha, 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 I ordered the snowstorm. Yeah, right, I'm great. But it does do damage because it suggests that you had a hand in the result.
You are great, though. We all agree on that. Okay, thank you all. Good conversation.